Hi, everybody. I'm going to give you the Atlantic slave trade in less than 5 minutes. This, together with Equiano, serves as the basis for your understanding of the Atlantic slave trade, something that people spend lifetimes studying. First thing to understand is that this was a trade. This was a trade between developed states in Europe and developed states in particularly West Africa, but other parts of Africa as well. As a trade, the first question we have to ask is, how could so many people let something so evil go on? Understand that 12.5 million Africans were sold into slavery and shipped out of West Africa for the Americas. Of those, about 11 million, 10.5 to 11 million people survived that trip to become enslaved, 90% of whom were enslaved in Brazil and the Caribbean. A far smaller proportion were sent to North America. In North America, there was what's called a natural increase in slaves, so that you didn't have to keep shipping new slaves there. Therefore, the slave population increased in North America, whereas in the Caribbean and Brazil, because of tropical diseases and the horrors of the work and the way they were treated, slaves had to be the slave population had to be continually renewed. It was far cheaper to go back to West Africa and ship a fresh, ready-to-work slave to a plantation in the Caribbean than it was to simply try to grow your own, so to speak. How did the Europeans let this continue? Well, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, how do we let this continue? Understand that there are 20 to 25 million people enslaved around the globe today. This is something that continues, that there are NGOs or non-governmental organizations fighting against it, but it is very much part of our modern economic system. According to the United Nations estimate, about 2.5 million people are trafficked every year. And I'm going to read you a quick quote from the United Nations report on human trafficking. They say, quote, "The term trafficking in persons can be misleading. It places the emphasis on the transaction aspects of the crime that is more accurately described as enslavement. 79% of these people are exploited sexually. Another 18% are forced into labor. And those are 2008 figures. So this continues to be a modern problem. Question we have to ask ourselves then is not just, how do the Europeans 100 years ago, 300 years ago let this happen? How do we let this happen? First thing I would say is that this is accepted by, and in fact part of, the rational calculus of the global market of free trade that was proposed and promoted during the Enlightenment. The height of the Atlantic slave trade was the 1700s. The 1700s was the age of enlightenment. So understand that Enlightenment thinkers not only accepted slavery, but arguably slavery was wrapped up in Enlightenment ideas. Another question you might ask yourself as well, how did these Africans go about selling their brothers? Why would Africans sell other Africans to Europeans, to whites? Understand that the Africans were not Africans. In other words, Equiano is Igbo. He is not African in any real sense until he gets out of the continent of Africa. He sees himself as different from other people in nearby states, and it's no more. He's no more their brothers than, say, white European Americans look upon Mexicans as their brothers. Yes, they're from the same landmass, but so what? These were different people. Why not trade them? Slavery existed in antiquity. Slavery existed in Africa, but it was a very different kind of slavery in Africa, a kind of social replacement slavery. In other words, it was something where you took people in battle and enslaved them. Essentially prisoners of war, where you used it as part of your criminal justice system. You couldn't build prisons, particularly in West Africa, so you simply made them slaves and brought them into the family. Final thing I'll say is, not only did this have an enormous human cost, disrupting, destroying the societies of Africa, but it also had an enormous environmental cost, destroying and disrupting the ecology, the ecosystems of Caribbean islands, which were wiped out in order to be planted with a very sweet grass known as sugarcane. All of this was done to create monocultures or single crop agricultural systems that not only grew sugarcane but processed that sugarcane into sugar so Europeans could have sweet tea, cake, and candy. Okay, 10 seconds, 12 seconds past 5, 13, 4. Oh, I guess I just keep going. That's it. The Atlantic Slave Trade on YouTube. Bye bye.